Some wounds never leave visible scars, but the deepest ones are often hidden behind the kindest smiles. Long after the grand estate had fallen silent for the night, only the gentle hum of the kitchen refrigerator and the distant ticking of an antique clock disturbed the stillness. Soft light spilled across polished marble countertops, while the aroma of freshly baked bread lingered in the air from preparations for the following morning. Grace Coleman stood alone beside the large farmhouse sink, drying the last crystal glass before carefully placing it back inside the cabinet. She always waited until everyone else had gone to bed before finishing her own work. It gave her a few precious moments when no one watched, no one whispered, and no one judged her simply for existing. Grace had worked inside the Moretti estate for almost 3 years. Every room she cleaned reflected perfection. Every meal she helped prepare carried the warmth of genuine care, and every employee quietly admitted that the house ran more smoothly because of her dedication. Yet very few people ever thanked her. Some ignored her completely, while others believed her gentle nature made her an easy target for careless jokes disguised as harmless humor. Grace rarely answered back. She believed that dignity did not grow louder when challenged. It simply became quieter. That evening had been harder than most. Earlier during a private dinner attended by several distinguished guests, a few members of the household staff had laughed behind her back after making cruel remarks about her appearance. They believed she could not hear them as she carried serving trays across the dining room. Every word settled silently inside her heart. She completed her duties with the same calm professionalism she always showed, smiled politely whenever someone thanked her for refilling a glass, and continued working until the final guest departed. Only after the mansion became completely quiet did she finally allow herself to cry. Standing alone in the kitchen, Grace covered her face with both hands as quiet tears slipped down her cheeks. She quickly wiped them away, embarrassed even though no one appeared to be there. She whispered to herself that tomorrow would be easier, just as she had whispered the same promise countless times before. At that exact moment, footsteps echoed softly through the hallway leading toward the kitchen. Grace immediately straightened her uniform and turned away, hoping whoever approached would never realize what had happened. The footsteps stopped at the doorway. Vincent Moretti stood there without speaking. Throughout New York, people knew him as a mafia boss whose calm presence commanded respect before he ever said a word. Inside his own home, employees rarely saw him after business hours because he preferred quiet evenings over unnecessary conversation. Tonight he had come downstairs intending only to pour himself a cup of coffee before returning to his study. Instead, he had heard something he had never expected inside his own home. He had heard someone trying not to cry. Vincent looked at Grace for several long seconds. She lowered her eyes, hoping he would simply leave without asking questions. He noticed the faint redness around her eyes, the trembling breath she struggled to steady, and the careful way she tried to pretend nothing had happened. His expression remained composed, yet something quietly changed behind his normally unreadable gaze. In a voice barely louder than a whisper, he asked the only question that mattered. Who hurt her? Grace looked up in surprise, unsure whether he had spoken to himself or to anyone else. The kitchen fell completely silent as the words settled into the room, carrying a weight that neither of them fully understood. Somewhere beyond those walls, someone believed they had merely embarrassed a quiet housemaid. They had no idea that the coldest man in the mansion had just begun searching for the truth. Grace barely realized she had stopped breathing after hearing Vincent's quiet question. No one had ever asked those words before. During the 3 years she had worked inside the Moretti estate, people usually noticed whether the silverware sparkled, whether the flowers had been arranged perfectly, or whether dinner arrived exactly on time. Very few noticed the woman who quietly made those things possible. Grace lowered her eyes and forced a small smile, hoping to end the conversation before it became uncomfortable. "No one, sir," she answered softly. "It was only a long day." Vincent remained where he stood. His reputation had been built on recognizing the difference between truth and carefully chosen words, and he immediately understood that Grace had offered the second instead of the first. Yet he did not press her. He simply nodded once before filling a glass with water instead of coffee. The silence between them felt strangely peaceful rather than awkward. After placing the glass on the counter beside her, he spoke with the same calm voice. "Everyone has difficult days. That does not mean they should carry them alone. Grace thanked him politely, but avoided meeting his eyes. She had learned long ago that drawing attention to her own pain only made life more complicated. She preferred finishing her work, returning to the small guest cottage behind the estate, and beginning another day as though nothing had happened. Vincent quietly left the kitchen without another question, but his thoughts remained there long after he disappeared down the hallway. The following morning, the mansion awakened before sunrise. Grace prepared breakfast exactly as she always did, greeting every employee with kindness despite the heaviness she still carried inside. She carefully arranged fresh fruit, baked warm biscuits, and brewed coffee while humming softly to herself. No one watching her would have guessed that only a few hours earlier she had been standing in the same room, trying to hide tears. Several members of the household staff entered the kitchen together. Their conversation stopped briefly when they noticed Grace, but only for a moment. Soon the whispers quietly returned. One employee laughed while another muttered something about how impossible it was for someone like Grace to move gracefully through such a beautiful mansion. A third person smiled without correcting the remark. None of them realized that Grace heard every word. She simply continued arranging breakfast trays with steady hands, refusing to allow bitterness to replace the kindness that had always guided her life. Upstairs, Vincent reviewed the day's schedule with his executive assistant, yet his attention drifted back to the previous night. He remembered the redness around Grace's eyes, the trembling breath she had tried to hide, and the unmistakable sadness that no exhausted employee could disguise so completely. Something about the situation felt deeply wrong. Grace had denied that anyone hurt her, but Vincent had spent an entire lifetime watching people conceal painful truths behind polite smiles. He trusted instinct more than easy answers. Rather than confronting anyone immediately, he quietly instructed his longtime estate manager to provide him with a complete report on daily operations inside the household. The request sounded ordinary enough that no one questioned it. However, Vincent added one final instruction before ending the conversation. "Do not tell anyone I asked." The estate manager nodded respectfully, unaware that Vincent had already begun looking beyond schedules and maintenance reports. He wanted to understand how the people inside his own home truly treated one another when they believed no one important was paying attention. Meanwhile, Grace carried a breakfast tray toward the sunlit dining room with the same quiet dignity she displayed every morning, never imagining that the tears she had tried so hard to hide had already set something powerful into motion. Somewhere inside the mansion, the truth remained hidden behind ordinary conversations and polite smiles, but it would not remain hidden forever. By late afternoon, the mansion had returned to its usual rhythm, polished floors reflecting warm sunlight, while every member of the household carried out familiar responsibilities with practiced precision. On the surface, everything appeared exactly as it had the day before. Meals arrived on time, flowers decorated every hallway, and conversations remained polite whenever someone of authority walked nearby. Yet beneath that carefully maintained order, invisible cracks had already begun to spread. Vincent said very little throughout the day, but he noticed far more than anyone realized. The estate manager quietly delivered the operational report Vincent had requested, describing schedules, assignments, and general performance. Every employee received favorable remarks for completing assigned duties. Grace's name appeared repeatedly beside words such as dependable, punctual, respectful, and exceptionally hardworking. Nothing inside the report explained why someone so consistently admired for her work had stood alone in the kitchen fighting back tears. Vincent closed the folder without speaking. He had spent enough years leading powerful organizations to understand that reports often revealed performance while hiding character. If he wanted the truth, he would need to observe people instead of paperwork. That evening, another private dinner brought several longtime business associates to the estate. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the formal dining room, while elegant music drifted softly through hidden speakers. Grace worked quietly beside the kitchen staff, carefully preparing each course before carrying serving platters into the dining room with steady hands. She moved with remarkable care despite the weight she carried, making certain every guest received the same thoughtful attention. Most visitors barely noticed her beyond offering brief thanks. A few members of the household staff noticed something else entirely. As Grace returned toward the kitchen after serving dessert, two employees standing near the service entrance exchanged amused glances. One quietly remarked that expensive homes always seemed larger whenever Grace walked through them. Another chuckled and suggested the kitchen probably contained fewer desserts now that she worked there. The comments were spoken softly enough that the guests could not hear them, but loudly enough for Grace to catch every word as she passed. She paused for the briefest moment before continuing forward without responding. Her shoulders remained straight, her expression composed, and her pace never changed. Years of quiet endurance had taught her that some people confused silence with weakness. Inside, however, every careless sentence settled heavily upon her heart. Unknown to everyone gathered inside the dining room, Vincent had stepped into the hallway moments earlier after receiving an important telephone call. As he returned, he caught only the final sentence before the employees immediately fell silent upon seeing him approach. Their smiles disappeared so quickly that the change itself drew his attention. Neither employee realized Vincent had noticed the uncomfortable glance Grace tried to hide as she disappeared through the kitchen doors. He continued walking without saying a single word, but his eyes lingered briefly on each employee before entering the dining room once again. The dinner concluded successfully, and the guests departed believing they had spent another pleasant evening inside one of New York's most respected estates. They never witnessed the quiet tension lingering behind the polished service. Later that night, after the household settled into silence, Vincent stood alone in his study, looking through large windows overlooking the estate grounds. He replayed the hallway moment repeatedly inside his mind. Grace had not defended herself. The employees had instantly changed their behavior when they noticed him nearby. Neither detail felt accidental. Vincent slowly reached for the intercom on his desk before calmly instructing the estate manager to arrange a mandatory staff meeting for the following morning. No explanation accompanied the request. No accusations were made. Yet somewhere inside the mansion, a quiet certainty had already taken shape. Vincent no longer questioned whether someone had hurt Grace. He had begun asking a far more important question. How many people had watched it happen and chosen to remain silent? The following morning arrived beneath a pale gray sky, and the mansion felt unusually quiet long before breakfast began. Every member of the household had received the same message before sunrise. Vincent Moretti expected the entire domestic staff to gather inside the estate library at exactly 8 o'clock. Meetings like this almost never happened. The employees entered one by one, exchanging uncertain glances while wondering what could possibly require the attention of every housekeeper, cook, gardener, driver, and maintenance worker at the same time. Grace stood near the back of the room, hoping to remain unnoticed as she always did. She assumed the meeting concerned upcoming events or changes to household schedules. The idea that it might involve her never crossed her mind. Vincent entered precisely on time, dressed in a charcoal suit with the calm expression that had earned respect long before he spoke. He thanked everyone for their work during the previous months and briefly acknowledged the effort required to maintain such a large estate. His voice remained steady and controlled, revealing nothing about the true reason for the gathering. After a moment of silence, he slowly looked around the room, meeting the eyes of every employee before speaking again. I have spent many years believing that a home reflects the character of the people living inside it, he said quietly. A beautiful house means nothing if respect does not exist within its walls. The room became noticeably still. Several employees lowered their eyes without understanding why they suddenly felt uncomfortable. Vincent continued speaking with the same measured tone. Over the past few days, I have realized there may be a difference between what I believed was happening inside this house and what has actually been taking place. Grace looked up in quiet surprise before quickly lowering her gaze again. She felt an uneasy knot form inside her stomach. Vincent was not looking toward her. Instead, he watched the entire room equally, refusing to single out anyone before knowing every detail. Before I make assumptions, he continued, I prefer facts. He then asked the estate manager to distribute small envelopes to every employee. Inside each envelope was a blank sheet of paper. Vincent explained that everyone would have 10 minutes to write anonymously about the atmosphere inside the estate, including whether they had witnessed disrespect, humiliation, or behavior that did not reflect the values expected within his home. No signatures would be required. No handwriting would be examined. Every answer would remain confidential. A quiet wave of uncertainty spread across the room. Some employees immediately began writing. Others stared silently at the blank page resting before them. Grace held the paper in both hands, but did not write a single word. She had never wanted anyone punished because of her pain. Even after everything she had endured, she still believed that kindness should remain stronger than resentment. Vincent noticed that hesitation without drawing attention to it. 10 minutes later, the envelopes were collected and placed upon the large oak table at the front of the library. Vincent thanked everyone and dismissed the meeting without reading a single response in front of them. As employees quietly returned to their duties, nervous whispers followed them into the hallways. Grace walked back toward the kitchen, believing the strange meeting had already ended. She never imagined that several anonymous letters inside those envelopes described the very same incidents she had tried so carefully to hide. More than one employee had finally admitted that cruel jokes about Grace's appearance had become an accepted habit among a small group of staff members. Others confessed that they had witnessed the behavior many times but remained silent because they feared becoming the next target. Alone inside the now empty library, Vincent slowly opened the first envelope, then the second, and then another. With every page he read, the quiet certainty inside him became impossible to ignore. Grace had never exaggerated her suffering because she had never spoken about it at all. The truth had revealed itself through the voices of people whose silence had finally become heavier than their fear. For the rest of the afternoon, Vincent remained inside his private study with the anonymous letters spread neatly across his desk. None of them mentioned Grace by name in the opening lines, yet every page gradually led back to the same quiet truth. Different employees described the same pattern from different perspectives. Some admitted they had laughed simply because everyone else had laughed. Others confessed they had remained silent because they feared becoming the next person to be mocked. One letter carried a sentence Vincent read more than once. "She always smiled at us the next morning, even after hearing what we said the night before." He slowly placed the paper back onto the desk and looked through the tall windows overlooking the estate gardens. He had spent years protecting his business from dishonesty outside those gates, while failing to notice that dignity had quietly been disappearing inside his own home. Meanwhile, Grace continued moving through her responsibilities exactly as she always had. She prepared afternoon tea for visiting guests, organized the pantry after a new grocery delivery, and helped one of the older housekeepers carry heavy boxes into the storage room. When the older woman thanked her, Grace simply smiled and replied that kindness became lighter whenever it was shared. She never mentioned the anonymous meeting earlier that morning. She assumed life would continue exactly as it always had. As evening approached, Vincent quietly reviewed several weeks of internal security recordings from common work areas throughout the estate. He had not intended to rely upon cameras, but the written statements had convinced him that understanding the full picture mattered more than assumptions. The recordings confirmed everything the letters described. He watched Grace patiently helping another employee finish a difficult task before returning to her own responsibilities without expecting recognition. He saw her staying late to organize supplies that someone else had left behind. He watched her comfort a young kitchen assistant who had accidentally broken an expensive serving bowl, reassuring the frightened employee before anyone else even noticed the accident. Then the recordings revealed something else. On more than one occasion, a small group of staff members exchanged mocking comments after Grace walked away, smiling only when they believed no supervisor remained nearby. Grace never answered them. She simply continued working with quiet dignity. Vincent leaned back in his chair, feeling an unexpected weight settle across his thoughts. The woman everyone considered the easiest target had quietly become the strongest example of character inside the entire estate. She had responded to disrespect with patience, to ridicule with professionalism, and to loneliness with compassion toward others. No report had measured those qualities because they could not be counted on a performance review. Yet they carried more value than flawless housekeeping or perfectly prepared meals. That evening, Vincent walked through the kitchen once again. Grace stood arranging fresh bread for breakfast exactly as she had done countless times before. She greeted him with the same respectful smile she offered every member of the household, never expecting special attention. Vincent noticed that despite everything she had endured, there was still genuine warmth in her voice. It was not forced. It was simply part of who she was. He thanked her for the day's work before quietly asking whether she had everything she needed. Grace looked surprised by the question, but answered honestly that she did. After he left, she stood silently for several moments, wondering why his concern felt so different from ordinary courtesy. Upstairs, Vincent made one final decision before ending the evening. The following morning, every employee would gather once again. This time there would be no anonymous letters, no hidden observations, and no unanswered questions. The truth had already revealed itself. Now the house that had witnessed quiet humiliation would finally witness something far more powerful. Respect would no longer be optional within the walls of the Moretti estate. The following morning unfolded beneath clear skies, but the atmosphere inside the Moretti estate felt heavier than the clouds of the previous day. Every member of the household assembled once again inside the grand library, this time sensing that the meeting would bring answers instead of questions. Grace quietly took her usual place near the back of the room, her hands folded gently before her. She wished the gathering would end quickly so everyone could return to work. The last thing she wanted was to become the center of attention. Vincent entered without hurry, his calm expression unchanged, yet the silence that followed him carried unusual weight. He waited until every conversation disappeared before speaking. "Yesterday, I asked each of you to tell me the truth," he began. "Many of you did. Some admitted mistakes. Others admitted something even more difficult. They confessed that they watched disrespect happen without saying a word. No one moved. The room remained perfectly still. Vincent slowly looked around the library before continuing. "I reviewed your statements alongside information available to me. They all point toward the same conclusion." He paused for several seconds before asking one quiet question. "Why was the kindest employee in this house treated with the least kindness?" The words settled over the room like complete silence. Several employees lowered their heads immediately. Others shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet Vincent's eyes. Grace felt her heart begin to race. She had never expected anyone to defend her, especially not in front of the entire household. One of the senior housekeepers finally stepped forward with visible regret. She admitted that careless jokes had become routine among a small group of employees and confessed that she had remained silent because confronting them seemed easier to avoid than conflict itself. Another employee quietly apologized for laughing even when the comments made her uncomfortable. Soon another voice joined, then another. One by one, people acknowledged choices they wished they could take back. No one attempted to justify the behavior anymore. Vincent listened without interrupting. When the final apology faded into silence, he spoke again with remarkable composure. "Character is revealed most clearly by how we treat the person who has the least power to defend themselves. Respect cannot exist only for guests, executives, or employers. If it disappears for one person, it disappears for everyone." He then turned toward Grace for the first time since entering the room. She looked startled by the attention, uncertain what to expect next. Vincent's voice remained gentle. "Grace, every report I have read praises your work. Every recording I reviewed showed patience, professionalism, and kindness. Even the people who failed you admitted that you never answered cruelty with cruelty. That deserves recognition." Grace immediately shook her head, quietly insisting that she did not want anyone embarrassed because of her. Vincent offered a small understanding smile before replying. "This meeting is not about embarrassment. It is about responsibility. A home cannot become better until the truth is allowed inside." He then announced several changes that would take effect immediately. Every employee would participate in new workplace standards centered upon mutual respect, mentoring, and accountability. Future concerns could be reported directly without fear of retaliation. More importantly, Vincent made one principle unmistakably clear. No person's appearance will ever determine the value of their voice inside this house. The library remained completely silent after those words. Grace looked around the room and noticed something she had not seen in years. The expressions facing her no longer carried amusement or quiet judgment. Many reflected sincere regret. Others reflected admiration they had never before expressed aloud. As the meeting ended, no applause filled the room and no dramatic celebration followed. Only a deep, thoughtful silence remained, because everyone present understood that something far more important than a household policy had just changed. For the first time since Grace arrived at the Moretti estate, Dignity had finally been spoken aloud, and every person in the room knew they would remember that moment for years to come. The days following the library meeting felt different in ways that could not be measured by schedules or written policies. The mansion still awakened before sunrise, breakfast was still served precisely on time, and every hallway continued shining with the same elegance visitors had always admired. Yet something invisible had changed inside the people who walked those polished floors. Conversations became more thoughtful. Careless laughter disappeared. Employees who had once passed Grace without a greeting now paused to wish her a good morning. Some offered quiet apologies while carrying fresh linens through the corridors. Others simply chose kindness where silence had once existed. Grace accepted every gesture with gentle humility, never reminding anyone of the past, because she believed genuine change deserved the opportunity to grow without constant reminders of old mistakes. Vincent observed these changes from a respectful distance. He had never intended to force kindness through authority alone. Rules could prevent disrespect, but only character could create compassion. One afternoon, he walked through the estate gardens after finishing several important meetings, noticing Grace helping the elderly groundskeeper gather fallen branches after a summer storm had scattered them across the pathways. The task was not part of her responsibilities, yet she knelt beside the older man with the same quiet patience she showed in every corner of the estate. When the groundskeeper thanked her for the assistance, Grace smiled warmly and answered that every home became stronger when people helped each other without keeping score. Vincent remained unnoticed beneath the shade of a large oak tree, listening quietly before continuing his walk. The simple conversation stayed with him far longer than the business negotiations waiting inside his office. Later that week, the estate hosted a charity luncheon attended by community leaders and longtime family friends. Grace once again helped coordinate the event behind the scenes, making certain every guest felt welcome while remaining almost invisible to those enjoying the afternoon. During the reception, one distinguished guest complimented Vincent on the flawless organization of the gathering and casually remarked that maintaining such perfection must require exceptional leadership. Vincent looked around the elegant room before answering with complete sincerity. "Leadership matters," he replied calmly, "but character matters more. The finest person working in this house is someone many people overlooked for far too long." Several guests followed his gaze and noticed Grace arranging fresh flowers near a window overlooking the gardens. She remained completely unaware that the conversation concerned her. Vincent did not reveal her private struggles or seek sympathy on her behalf. He simply acknowledged the truth without hesitation. His words spread quietly through the room, leaving many guests thoughtfully silent. Grace eventually learned about the conversation from the estate manager later that evening. Embarrassed by the unexpected praise, she gently insisted that she had only done the work anyone else would have done. The estate manager smiled kindly before answering, "That is exactly why people admire you." Those simple words touched Grace more deeply than she expected. For years, she had measured success by completing every task without complaint. She had never imagined that someone would value the quiet spirit behind those ordinary actions. As sunset painted the sky with shades of gold beyond the mansion windows, Vincent stood alone in the library, reflecting upon everything that had changed since the night he found Grace quietly crying in the kitchen. He realized that protecting someone's dignity required far more than correcting a single injustice. It required creating an environment where kindness became the standard instead of the exception. Looking across the peaceful estate, Vincent understood that respect had finally taken root inside the home, not because people feared his authority, but because one quiet woman had reminded everyone that true strength is always revealed by the way we choose to treat those who expect nothing in return. Nearly a month passed, and the quiet transformation inside the Moretti estate became impossible to ignore. Visitors continued admiring the elegance of the mansion, but those who worked there understood that its greatest change could not be seen in polished marble or crystal chandeliers. It lived in the way people greeted one another each morning, in the willingness to offer help without being asked, and in the absence of the whispers that had once filled the hallways whenever Grace walked by. She continued performing her duties with the same humility that had always defined her character. She never acted as though she had won a victory, because she had never viewed anyone else as an opponent. To Grace, kindness was not a reward earned after justice. It remained a choice she made every single day. One Friday afternoon, Vincent received an invitation to attend a community appreciation ceremony honoring local volunteers who had quietly served neighborhoods throughout the city. The organizers explained that several nominations had come from people connected to the Moretti estate. Curious, Vincent reviewed the list of nominees before the event. One name immediately captured his attention. Grace Coleman had been nominated not by senior staff or management, but by the gardeners, drivers, kitchen assistants, housekeepers, and maintenance employees who worked beside her every day. Their letters described moments that had never appeared in performance reports. They wrote about Grace staying late to help someone finish exhausting tasks without asking for overtime. They described how she prepared meals for employees working overnight during severe winter storms. Others shared stories of Grace quietly buying school supplies for the child of a fellow employee after learning the family was struggling financially. She had never spoken about any of those acts because she never considered them extraordinary. Vincent slowly closed the folder, realizing that the people who once overlooked Grace had now become the strongest witnesses to her character. The ceremony took place inside a historic community theater filled with families, volunteers, teachers, and neighborhood leaders. Grace attended only because her co-workers insisted she deserved the recognition, and she spent most of the evening hoping someone else would receive the award instead. When her name was finally announced, she looked around in complete surprise before slowly walking toward the stage. The audience rose together in warm applause that continued far longer than she expected. Standing near the back of the theater, Vincent quietly watched without announcing his presence. The presenter explained that the award recognized individuals who strengthened communities through compassion, humility, and consistent service rather than public recognition. As Grace accepted the simple crystal plaque, she spoke only a few heartfelt words. "Every person deserves to feel respected," she said softly. "If I have ever helped someone feel less alone, then I have already received more than enough in return." The theater became completely silent before another wave of applause filled the room. Vincent realized that nothing he could ever say would improve upon those words. They carried the same quiet truth that had first stopped him in the kitchen weeks earlier. After the ceremony ended, Grace stepped outside into the cool evening air, surprised to find Vincent waiting beside the entrance. He congratulated her with a genuine smile and admitted that he had learned something important from watching her. "Power can change rules," he said calmly, "but only character changes hearts." Grace smiled with quiet gratitude before answering. "Sometimes hearts only need someone willing to believe they can become better." They stood together for a peaceful moment beneath the city lights, watching families return home with laughter echoing through the streets. Neither of them realized that the greatest recognition of the evening had never been the award placed in Grace's hands. It had been the undeniable proof that genuine goodness, when practiced consistently and without seeking attention, eventually becomes impossible for the world to ignore. Autumn arrived quietly, painting the trees surrounding the Moretti estate with shades of amber and gold, while cool morning air drifted through open windows carrying the scent of fresh leaves. Months had passed since the morning Vincent chose to replace silence with truth, and the mansion no longer felt like a place where people simply worked. It had become a home where respect greeted every person before status ever could. New employees quickly noticed something different about the estate. Everyone, from the executive chef to the newest groundskeeper, treated one another with genuine courtesy. They soon learned that kindness was no longer considered extraordinary within those walls. It had become part of the culture itself. Grace remained exactly the woman she had always been. She still arrived before sunrise, still prepared breakfast with quiet care, still remembered every employee's favorite morning coffee, and still offered encouragement whenever someone struggled through a difficult day. The only difference was that she no longer carried the invisible weight of believing she had to endure disrespect in silence. She walked through the hallways with the same humility, but now she was surrounded by people who greeted her with sincere appreciation instead of careless judgment. Vincent noticed the change every day without needing anyone to mention it. One crisp Saturday morning, he entered the kitchen much earlier than usual and found Grace preparing homemade cinnamon rolls for the entire staff before the estate awakened. The warm aroma filled the room while sunlight stretched across the marble countertops exactly where he had first found her standing with tears in her eyes. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Vincent simply looked around the peaceful kitchen before smiling quietly. "It feels different in here," he said. Grace glanced toward the windows where golden leaves drifted gently through the morning breeze. "People feel safe here now," she answered softly. "That changes everything." Vincent nodded, understanding those words more deeply than anyone else could. He realized that the kitchen had never truly been transformed by new policies or meetings. It had been transformed by one person's unwavering decision to answer cruelty with dignity instead of bitterness. Later that afternoon, the entire household gathered in the garden for a simple harvest celebration. There were no distinguished guests, no business partners, and no formal speeches. It was only the people who shared the estate every day, enjoying a meal together beneath strings of warm lights hanging between old oak trees. Laughter replaced whispers. Conversations flowed naturally across every table. The barriers that had once separated people by position quietly disappeared beneath ordinary acts of friendship. Before dinner began, Vincent stood to thank everyone for their dedication throughout the year. His remarks were brief, but one sentence remained with every person present. "A strong house is not built by stone, wealth, or influence," he said calmly. "It is built by the way its people choose to protect one another." His eyes briefly met Grace's before he returned to his seat. No further explanation was necessary. Everyone understood exactly what he meant. As evening settled across the estate, Grace stood alone. For a quiet moment beside the kitchen doorway where everything had begun months before. She remembered the loneliness she had once carried into that room and the tears she believed no one would ever notice. She also remembered one simple question spoken with genuine concern instead of judgment. Sometimes the smallest words become the beginning of the greatest changes. Vincent looked toward the glowing kitchen windows from across the garden and smiled with peaceful gratitude. He had believed power was measured by how many people obeyed his voice. Grace had quietly taught him that true strength is measured by how many people feel protected because of it. And on that gentle autumn evening, every person inside the Moretti estate understood a truth they would carry for the rest of their lives. Respect given freely will always become the greatest legacy anyone can leave behind.